So Netanyahu is going to play Joe Biden like a fiddle. You can make the argument that he will play in due course Donald Trump like a fiddle. We'll see what happens. But if you look at precedents, there's every reason to think that Netanyahu, if he goes toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, will win. I mean, there's no question that any president of the United States is going to have incredibly small amounts of maneuver room when dealing with Israel because of the power of the lobby. Well, it's quite clear the Israelis are going to stay and probably try to annex a big slice of southern Syria. And by the way, they're staying in southern Lebanon as well. They've not left there, which they were supposed to do according to the terms of the ceasefire. And by the way, they've also said they're not going to abandon the Philadelphia corridor, which is the line between Egypt and Gaza, which they were obliged to do this Saturday when the second phase of the ceasefire is put in play. The Israelis are doing absolutely horrible things in the West Bank, as they continue to do in the Gaza Strip. And their ultimate goal, again, is to drive the Palestinians out. And a permanent ceasefire will get in the way of that. I think the last thing he wants is a permanent ceasefire, because I think the ultimate goal that Israel has is to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Greater Israel. And this includes the West Bank as well as Gaza. And although what's going on in the West Bank doesn't get as much attention as what's going on in Gaza, but my guess is that the Arab League will come up with a plan for Gaza and may even come up with a plan that includes the West Bank. But the question is, what will the Israelis do? And the Israelis will not pay any attention to that plan. They're not going to accept an Arab plan. And furthermore, the Americans and the Europeans will back the Israelis up no matter what. So we'll be back to square one. So Netanyahu may be gloating now, but he ought to think long and hard, as many Israelis and their supporters should think about where this country is, where it's headed, and what that all adds up to, because this is not good. So the Israelis, they just do what they want. And again, the United States and the Europeans will back them no matter what. So what you see here is creeping annexation. And this is hardly surprising at all. Netanyahu talked about admiration for Israel. When I was young, there was a great deal of admiration for Israel in the United States and really around the world. But what's happened over time, and it's accelerated in the last few years, is that Israel has become a pariah state in almost all quarters. It's really quite remarkable. I believe here, even in the United States, there is a significant slice of the population that fully understands what Israel has become and where Israel is headed. And of course, as I've said on a number of occasions on this show, this situation's only going to get worse with time. Because in those days, remember, I was there from 1966 to 1970, and the Israelis won the war in 1948. They won a war in 56, and then they won the 97 war, which was widely viewed as a classic military victory on a par with the German victory against France in 1940. So they were very highly regarded. And furthermore, in those days, the Israelis were considered David up against Goliath. Because many of the myths that underpin that David versus Goliath worldview had not been shattered. But since, the early 1970s, my thinking, and I think the thinking of large numbers of people, including many Israelis, about Israel itself has changed significantly. I mean, you want to remember that the United States has a deep-seated interest in having stability in the Middle East. You remember Jake Sullivan, about 2 weeks before October 7th, was really pleased to announce that the Middle East had never been so peaceful in a long time, and this was really good news for the United States. Well, what applied then applies now. Trump has a deep-seated interest in having a peaceful Middle East. He has a deep-seated interest in solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just like he has a deep-seated interest in solving the Ukrainian conflict. The problem that Trump faces is he has so many different problems on his plate, so many situations where he's trying to fundamentally alter policy, and he's running into resistance in every one of those cases. So he has to be careful that he's not overwhelmed. And he may just not want to spend the political capital to defeat the lobby or to confront the lobby on Gaza because he wants to save his political capital for dealing with Ukraine. The question is, what can he do to achieve that end? And I would say, in response to your question, that if Netanyahu starts the genocide again, or even just large-scale killing, that I think Trump has very powerful incentives to get Bibi to shut it down. And I would not be surprised if Trump has allies inside of Israel. Again, I think the IDF has had enough war for the time being and would be sympathetic to any moves that Trump made to prevent Bibi from starting the genocide again. So one could argue that at this point in time, from Trump's point of view, Ukraine is the number one issue. And how he thinks about the Middle East will be heavily influenced by what's going on vis-a-vis the Russians. Trump makes so many boasts that he doesn't carry through on, that the costs of making these sorts of boasts and then not delivering is not very great. It's like when he says Canada is going to become the 51st state. Who seriously believes that? Or who seriously believes that he's going to turn the Gaza Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East? Even Lindsey Graham has told him that this is a foolish idea. I'm not arguing that there are statements that he makes that are of no consequence at all. Some statements that he makes are of huge consequence. And what he's doing on Ukraine, and in particular what he's doing vis-a-vis Zelensky, is of great consequence. So he just makes these boasts and people don't pay much attention to them. Biden was president when the genocide started, and Biden had all sorts of opportunities to act to stop the genocide and to influence Israeli policy in Gaza in ways that would put an end to the killing. This is not an issue for Trump at this point. Trump is walking into a situation where there is a ceasefire and where the Israelis really don't have an incentive to start up again with the genocide. There's no question that Trump, like Biden, is going to give the Israelis all of the deadly weaponry that they want and that we have. With some small exceptions. So in that sense, there's a continuation. But I think the key point you want to keep in mind is that Trump is operating in a very different environment, strategic environment in the Middle East than Biden was operating in. So the question is, how does Trump operate in that situation, which again is very different than the one that Biden confronted when he was president? Now, Netanyahu may have inclinations in that direction, but I think even he realizes that's not in his interest. His interest is just to make sure you don't have a ceasefire so he can keep his coalition together. You want to remember the IDF is in many ways a spent force. You don't hear much about this here in the West, but I believe the principal reason that you got a ceasefire on January 19th, and one of the principal reasons you're likely to get a second phase, is because the IDF is not interested in starting the war up again. He wants to make sure doesn't happen, I believe, is that you get a second phase of the ceasefire. And if you do get a second phase of the ceasefire, you don't get a third phase. He doesn't want a ceasefire, but that's not the same as saying that he wants to go in to Gaza and start the genocide up again. I think that the Saudis are at a point now where it's almost impossible to imagine them backing off from their demand that there be a Palestinian state before you have an Abraham Accord. Nor do the Saudis want a Palestinian state in Jordan or in Egypt.
Right.
They want a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza, with the capital of that Palestinian state being East Jerusalem. And I think the chances of that happening are remote, to put it mildly. And therefore, it's hard for me to imagine that you're going to get an Abraham Accord anytime soon, despite the fact that Trump wants it. And of course, the Israelis want it as well. China has grown more powerful economically. It's turned a lot of that economic might into military might. And as you would expect, they're beginning to, throw their weight around. They're acting much the way the United States acts. As you well know, the United States has a Navy that has a significant forward presence, and we're constantly roaming around in the waters right off the coast of countries like China. This is just sort of the normal course of events for us. And what you should expect to happen is, as China gets more powerful, that it's going to build a blue water navy with a lot of power projection capability, and it's going to try to throw its weight around. It's going to try to send signals to the Australians, send signals to the Filipinos that we're in charge here. I think that's a misreading of the Chinese. The Chinese are not a status quo power. They want to dominate the South China Sea, and this explains a lot of what's going on with the Philippines. And they want to reduce American influence as much as possible in East Asia, and if anything, push the Americans beyond the first island chain, then beyond the second island chain. Well, I think it's important to emphasize that the Chinese are hardball players. They are interested in dominating East Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's commonplace in this country to make the argument that it's the United States the source of all trouble in East Asia.